Starting, all attendees are in listen-only mode.
Go ahead, Maria.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I noticed that we have about 19 out of 45 people that are scheduled to attend this webinar. So hopefully we'll have some more people join us shortly. But this is Maria Vanderkolk. I am the Director of Professional Development for the National Association of Government Communicators. I'm the Communications Director for the City of Arvada, Colorado, and we're very happy to have you join us today. Just going to give a brief introduction about NAGC. We are a national network of federal, state, and local government employees, and our purpose is to advance communications as an essential professional resource at every level of government. So really, we like to emphasize it is for all levels of government, local, state, federal, etc. And it's truly just a wonderful group of people. So if you are not a member of NAGC, we certainly hope that you'll consider joining. This is really my favorite communications association that I've ever been involved with. So I encourage you to find out more about the organization at nagc.com. One of the benefits that we provide to our membership are these webinars that we have begun. And we're working hard to provide informative webinars on a monthly basis to everyone who cares to join us. And we've been providing these webinars free of charge for everyone who wants to sign up. Beginning next year, it is our plan to begin charging folks who are not NAGC members to register for our webinars. So we really hope that you're finding that the content is valuable. And again, we just really encourage you to join our association. One benefit currently for NAGC members is that you do have access to the presentations after the webinar is over. You have access to the audio recording and the presentation itself on our website, but you have to be a member for that. And just a quick introduction for our next webinar, so you can sort of save the date. Our next one is on January 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic of that is dealing with difficult audiences. The presenter will be Larry Tracy, who is a retired Army colonel and author of several books, and the purpose of this webinar is to learn how to win over audiences that are difficult to deal with, which hopefully will be kind of a good continuation of our webinar today. So let me move into the introduction of today's webinar, which is titled Chaos to Collaboration, a New Paradigm for Public Engagement. Our speaker is Larry Schooler. I'll introduce him in a moment. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar by typing them in. And if the question is timely, Larry has encouraged me to interrupt him. He likes to have kind of a back and forth if it works, or otherwise we can wait till the end of his formal presentation to ask our questions. So let me now introduce our speaker. Larry Schooler manages community engagement, public participation, and alternative dispute resolution projects for the city of Austin, Texas. He also works as a mediator, facilitator, and public engagement consultant for outside clients. He is a senior fellow at the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Life at the University of Texas, on the faculty of Southern Methodist University, and he is immediate past president for the International Association for Public Participation. His work has been featured by a variety of organizations and publications, including Governing Magazine and the National League of Cities. He holds a master's degree in conflict analysis and resolution and is pursuing a doctorate in that field. He is the author of a manual titled The Public and Public Policy, Keys to a Successful Community Meeting, and a forthcoming book on the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States. In his former career, he was an award-winning reporter and anchor for National Public Radio and Voice of America. So I will turn it over to Larry Schooler.
Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon or good morning to everybody. I guess it's a prerequisite to be a presenter with NAGC that your first name be Larry, because I apparently am the first of two Larrys on these webinar series. So I'm glad that my very unusual first name is finally getting some attention from NAGC. But I want to thank NAGC and Michelle and Maria for inviting me, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with me today. As was said, I really encourage participation. After all, this is a conversation about public participation, and so the more questions and comments you have, the better. Just type them into the window, and I'm happy to incorporate them as best I can into the presentation as we go forward. But I like at the beginning of these to kind of get a sense for who's on the line and what was the sort of the level of experience or expertise that folks are bringing to the conversation, so that I might kind of tailor a little bit of what I'm going to say here. So I think that we've got a couple of poll questions we'd like to pose to you to get a feel for who's on the line, and if we could go to those now, that would be great. So I know there's one question. I'm not sure which question we have up first. Can someone read it out?
Yes, the question is, how often do you work on public engagement projects? Every day, at least once a week, once a month, once a quarter, or seldom or never?
I recognize that not everybody is addicted to public engagement like I am, so I'm curious to see how often you all find yourself working on projects like this. And I don't think I'm able to see, I do see the poll. I'm not sure that I'll be able to see the results, but I'll try. Let me know when we close it, and if there are results we can look at. Be good if we could. Have we closed the poll? Do we have results?
I don't see anything. Michelle, do you have it? Here we go. Do you see that, Larry?
Oh, there. I do see it, yeah. Oh, so it looks like we do have a good number of folks who work on public engagement quite regularly, which is great, and then a handful of folks who do it a little less often. But I'm pleased to see we have fellow public engagement addicts on the line today. That's great. Maybe one more poll question that has to do with kind of the way that we emotionally respond to working on public engagement. My suspicion is that folks who work on this all the time have positive emotions when they think about engaging the public. But when you think of engaging the public, what emotion first comes to mind? Is it fear, dread, anxiety, excitement, or jubilation? So pick one that first comes to mind or comes to heart, and we'll see what we're dealing with emotionally here. So if we can close the poll and see the results, that'd be great. Anxiety is the predominant emotion, it looks like, with some excitement. That's good, but it's very healthy to feel that kind of anxiety. I have to admit that sometimes I still get some butterflies or other kinds of related feelings when I get started with a public meeting. So it's very normal, and I hope that some of what we talk about today will help you quell some of that anxiety, but it's certainly normal to feel that way. All right, thanks for participating in the polls, and I think we'll move on to the presentation. So let me advance a slide here and make sure that it advances. All right, well, as the introduction mentioned, I'm from Austin, Texas, which is the self-proclaimed live music capital of the world, so I would be remiss if one of my slides didn't include musical reference. So I should have done a poll on which musician people like better, the gentleman on the left, Billy Joel, or the gentleman on the right, Garth Brooks, but be that as it may, they both recorded a song called Shameless, which I will spare you singing, but there's a lyric in the song that really resonates with me and the work that I do on public engagement. They sing, "I don't have the power now, but I don't want it anyhow, so I gotta let it go." And that's gotta, not have to. And so the relevance to me is that whether or not you sort of formally give the public a bully pulpit to participate in discussions about policies that are going to affect them, my contention would be is they can already bully their way onto the pulpit. And by that, I don't just mean a literal pulpit like a podium at a city council meeting, but I mean virtually, whether it's through social media, through email, through jamming phone lines, through physically showing up outside city or state or county or even federal offices to block folks from doing their jobs. In other words, especially with the tools available to the public these days for communicating with one another, it is that much easier for them to sort of bully their way into the conversation and influence it in one way or the other. So my contention is we should really be thinking about how to engage the public proactively, thoughtfully, inclusively, and fairly. By proactively, I mean thinking about how to engage before there's a major conflict or a crisis. By thoughtfully, I mean thinking very specifically about who we're trying to engage, what stakeholders, what segments of the population. Inclusively, and by that I mean thinking about all of the different ways people can and choose to participate. You know, some people get excited about coming to a public meeting and want to make a speech. Others want to come to the meeting but are fairly soft-spoken. Others would never come to a meeting but might have something meaningful to contribute if you caught them somewhere out in public, or if you called them, or if you visited their home, or what have you. And fairly, making sure that those who are well organized have a way to participate, as well as those who aren't but nevertheless have something to share. So my focus is on engaging the public proactively, thoughtfully, inclusively, and fairly. So when we think about the public, we really have to think about ways to include all of those affected by a decision, to enable all of those affected by a decision to be able to affect that decision. And that really comes into play when you think about sort of hard to reach populations. A lot of times when I list seniors, some people kind of say, well, that's actually an easier to reach population because many of them are retired and have more spare time. But the reality is that while that may be true, a large number of the senior citizens that I interact with have difficulty, driving or getting transported to meetings or participating in other ways. So it's important that we think very holistically about how to engage that community, as well as the disabled community, both physically and mentally. I'm assuming that a lot of folks on the call today are living in places that have increasing numbers of folks for whom English isn't their most comfortable language, and we need to think about that population. When I say youth, I mean anyone from an age where they can talk and have feelings all the way up through college and beyond, because we all know that it can be difficult to get young adults to vote or to participate in other ways until they're more of a full-fledged taxpayer. And then the low-income population is important because, again, many of them lack the spare time or the other resources needed to come out to a meeting, and we need to think of ways that we can effectively engage them. And this is about more than just an episodic engagement where we have one fun visioning process and then we don't engage again. It's really about creating a sustained culture of collaboration in which people in your community really come to expect that they'll be able to meaningfully influence and impact any decision that could potentially affect them. So what this requires, in my opinion, is kind of a paradigm shift. In my view, a lot of times we think about the public as customers, which is to say they put their sort of tax dollars into a metaphorical vending machine, and out comes the services that we provide. So others are defining those needs and choices, and they're more of a consumer. They're thinking about what's in it for me, and they want the services, but they're not thinking as much about the costs associated with those services, particularly an increase in services. A citizen, and by that I don't mean the immigration status kind of connotation, but just a citizen, a participant in a society, is more accountable and committed and involved in determining the future and realizing that change will really come through citizens, not through elites. And so it requires sort of a paradigm shift on the part of the public, but it also requires some changing behaviors on the part of both public administrators, communications folks, and elected officials. A lot of public administrators, particularly those with a high degree of technical expertise, really think that it's their job to leverage that expertise to come up with the right approach. And the truth of the matter is there are plenty of situations where alternatives delivered by the public can be that much more effective, if not more politically palpable, than stuff that's been developed by staff. So it's not meant to cut staff out of the equation by any means. Staff still plays a critical role in framing the issue and finding a way to deliver their expertise to the public as they give input. But it's important for staff and public administrators to really be open to alternative ideas and be less controlling of an outcome and more controlling of a process, and be a listener, not just a deliverer of information. And the same for the elected official. A lot of elected officials, particularly as this campaign year winds down, have been, saying exactly what they're going to do without necessarily listening to their constituents about what they want done. And so it's important to understand the citizens' values, the power of involving citizens, and the significance of them feeling involved, and the importance of listening outward rather than just to their own conscience. So let's not kid ourselves. There are challenges associated with making this paradigm shift. If we engage to a greater extent than we are now, our decision-making processes could get longer, more expensive, and more complex. We might be having more meetings or using more tools or just getting more involved than we were previously when we might have just developed a policy and then put it out for comment. But my contention would be to you, and there's been research to support this, that decisions made under these more involved public engagement processes tend to be more credible, more durable, meaning they last longer, more creative in that they have more people weighing in, and more legitimate, meaning that they could have more political support from more corners of the population. Program implementation also can potentially happen more quickly. The public can feel more informed, and it can provide opportunities for community building. So sometimes the benefits take longer to see than the challenges that surface, but it's my contention that as we invest more on the front end in engagement, we save quite a bit in fending off, in avoiding, I should say, things like lawsuits that challenge policy or recall elections off cycle or protests that require police overtime. A lot of costs that we don't plan on but often experience and encounter when the public feels shut out of a policy-making process. So this isn't just something you should take my word on. We're starting to see real signs that this is taking hold, especially at the local level. There was a survey commissioned by the American Planning Association that found the significant majority of the public believe that engaging citizens through local planning is essential, not just because it's the morally right thing to do, but essential to economic recovery and to job creation. And the National League of Cities found that a substantial number of cities are now using these public engagement processes, doing more than just the standard public hearing, often or sometimes. So this is really spreading. And there have been several studies that have now come out, and I've got some links up to those, that show how democratic engagement cuts costs, how it adds value instead of just being sort of a norm that folks should comply with, but that it can really help with saving money for a government and more effectively delivering services, on the contention that if the government agency better understands the needs of the public, then they can provide services that truly meet the public's needs and not waste money on things that aren't being as well supported. And also, according to the National Conference on Citizenship, which is a leading national congressionally chartered nonprofit, the shift towards this paradigm would lead to more effective leadership, stronger communities, and more meaningful relationships between citizens and their government. So one of the things that I like to start with in thinking about what this looks like is with a set of core values. So what you're seeing here are the set of core values for the practice of public participation that have been developed by the International Association for Public Participation. Their acronym is IAP2, and as was mentioned, I'm the immediate past president of the U.S. affiliate. And as you can see here, this is fairly straightforward, but it takes a little bit of thought to think of how to actually implement this when you're engaging the public. So it's based on the belief that those who are affected by a decision have a right to be involved in the decision-making process, and the promise that the public's contribution will influence the decision. So it could be fairly easy to just put an extra planning meeting on the schedule, but if we don't understand the relationship between the output of that meeting and the influence it'll have on the policy, then sometimes it doesn't really make sense to have that meeting. We have to have a clear sense of how it is that the public's contribution will actually make a difference, and they need to understand that. Public participation promotes sustainable decisions by looking at the needs of and interests of everyone, including the decision makers. So in other words, if a city council is determined not to raise taxes, then that's something that needs to be incorporated into the public discussion. We're open to your input, but only if we can make it work with existing dollars, for instance. Public participation seeks out and facilitates the involvement of those potentially affected by or interested in a decision. It seeks input from participants in designing how they participate. So do we want public meetings? Do we want workshops? Do we want street-based outreach? Do we want online tools? We give public the information they need to participate in a meaningful way, which means that our one-pagers and our PowerPoints are not drowning in jargon and acronyms, but are really in clear language that anyone can understand, so that they then have the context to be able to provide good input. And I think most importantly that we communicate to participants how their input affected a decision. For instance, when we were asking the public in Austin for input on the bonds, we took a series of surveys that they did and aggregated the results, and that essentially became what went on our ballot that following November. So that's a clear way we were able to show how input affected a decision. One of the other issues that I think is at play in several communities and parts of the United States and frankly around the world is that we have a set of baseline requirements that are very much outdated. You know, they require things like, you know, a public hearing or some other public comment period that really doesn't meaningfully allow for folks to participate and give meaningful input that will actually affect the outcome. And so one of the things that's been done is the development of a set of templates for both cities and states for new public policy, new public participation policies. And so if you go to deliberative-democracy.net, you can get information and templates that can be used in your city or state that can help you sort of frame out what you're trying to accomplish with public participation. We, at the City of Boston, actually developed a set of engagement principles, and we did that because there's so many different departments at the city that are doing public engagement, and we wanted to build some consistency in the way we carried it out. We also wanted to make sure that our staff, as well as any contractors we work with, understand sort of our basic core values, and also to show the public the value of their engagement and what they can expect and hold us accountable to. And so this is, I'm going to go through quickly a set of principles that we've developed, and you're welcome to email me, and I'm happy to send you the entire list. But one of ours was accountability and transparency, give clear information on issues, ways to participate, and how the participation contributes to the decision. Another is to make sure that we maintain a safe environment that cultivates and supports respectful public engagement. And we added, we expect participants to do so in turn. I'm sure that the anxiety that many of us feel before a public meeting is partly based on the way that we've seen the public behave. And I would submit to you that it's very important for us to convey that this is a shared responsibility, that we're not anybody's, you know, parent or school principal. We are a facilitator of dialogue between us and them, and so it's important that we all agree that we're going to cultivate and support respectful public engagement. Accessibility for us means more than just being ADA compliant. It means that we will provide ample public notice of ways to engage and accommodations that enable all to participate. So certainly having our meetings at ADA compliant buildings is one way to go about that, but so is providing an interpreter for Spanish or other languages. So is providing resources for childcare and refreshments and other ways for people to be able to participate so that all have that opportunity. We also want to make sure that we give the public adequate preparation for participation by providing meeting agendas, discussion guidelines, notes, and information on next steps so that they come to expect how things are going to go. We also wanted to set out the idea of using both innovative and proven engagement solutions, but also customized to meet the specific needs of the project and the specific stakeholders, and be responsible stewards of public dollars. There are times when public wants to have additional meetings or carry out a process for longer than the city can really afford to do so, and so we wanted to be very mindful of the fact that we don't have an unlimited supply of funds, and so we want to use our resources wisely, including when it comes to engagement. So we did some research leading up to our development of principles, and I wanted to share with you some themes that we found when we looked at principles elsewhere. These might help you all to develop a set of themes for your own organization. Valuing participation, that the participation will really meaningfully impact results. Valuing participants, in other words, we have a civil and respectful tone, but we also can collect input through a variety of different ways. We don't just have to have a discussion on policy options. We could have storytelling, we could have a video booth, we could have a dot stickers for people to use to indicate their preferences, so multiple different ways to gather input. Be inclusive and diverse, make sure that our outreach is truly going to reach an entire population, and make sure that we look to develop decisions and processes that really do allow for all people to participate meaningfully. Accessibility and information provision, I touched on that earlier, making sure that our information is easily understood and accessible and give folks the information they need to be able to participate meaningfully. Promoting dialogue, deliberation, discussion, and listening. Dialogue and deliberation is a phrase you hear a lot in this field, and the idea is that we don't just want to necessarily gather input. We also want to ask the public to wrestle with some of the trade-offs associated with public engagement, because a lot of times people come in with their single issue that they want to advocate for, and they don't realize that there are competing agendas and a variety of different folks with interests that they want to see carried out. And so we want to provide ways for folks to not just give us their brainstormed ideas, but then to also wrestle with some of those trade-offs with each other. Another best practice is timing. Try to get the public involved as early as possible in a decision-making process and keep them involved throughout the process. Give them enough time to review information ahead of participating. Tailor and evaluate your process as you go forward. So you may set out to do things in a certain way, but find that the public isn't responding as effectively to those techniques, and you ought to alter things a little bit. Building credibility of and belief in a process, so showing the public how their participation affected the decision. Be transparent and record the notes and record the decisions that are made. Make sure you have a diverse and representative public base, and really show how your ultimate solution highlights the shared priorities that you heard from the public during your process. Ongoing education of citizens and city staff, I think, is also an interesting idea, because you see a lot of cities now doing like a City Works Academy or a Citizens Academy to teach folks how the city operates and to provide support to neighborhood groups. You see a lot of Office of Neighborhoods, Office of Neighborhood Engagement, to really help enhance leadership capacity of the folks in your community who want to be involved. And also be very clear about why we're engaging, what it is that we're trying to get out of this. Make sure we allocate resources, and make sure that our staff feel properly prepared to engage in this kind of input with the public. So I now want to give you a couple of examples of ways that we've innovated in the public engagement space, on the theory that the more collaborative that we can be, the better the experience will be for everybody, including participants, staff, and elected officials. So I mentioned our bond process a little while ago, and this picture comes from one of our bond public workshops. One of the things I want you to notice is that people are seated in small groups, as opposed to all the chairs being in rows like you'd see at a pew or in a lecture hall, and some poor sap is standing at the front to receive all of the venom or the venting from the public. This is meant to be a conversational space. Folks were given a name tag when they walked in that had a number on it, and so they were sent to a particular table so that the groups were a healthy mix of different perspectives. So the idea here was to understand what the public's priorities were in relation to the bond, because we had a lot more in needs for infrastructure than we had funds to allocate. So we wanted the public's help wrestling with those difficult decisions. So we laid out a game board here on the table, and we gave them fake money to the tune of $400 million, and we asked them to work as a group to figure out how to allocate that money across different categories of spending. They also, though, had a chance to walk around the room to these different stations that detailed the different projects, and they could put sticker dots next to the projects that they really liked. Some people came to these meetings just to advocate for a particular project, so we wanted to honor that form of participation as well as the form that was at a more macro level. But as I indicated before, what was nice about this was we took all of the results of these games as well as an online version of this, and we aggregated the totals, and then what ended up on the ballot was an almost perfect replica of those aggregate public results, and all but one of the items passed, and then that item was resubmitted a year later and passed. So what we find is that the more the public feels as if they've had a say in the generation of the idea for policy, the more likely they are to support that policy. So that's one way to kind of rethink the way you design a public meeting, is something more interactive and participatory. In that same vein, we've worked with a model that we've seen in several places called the meeting in a box, where you might have had the public meeting at a particular place, but you want more than just those people that show up to participate. And so you package the contents of that public meeting into a box, either a physical box or as a PDF download. And so within that box, you provide a facilitator guide, a participant guide, and some method of receiving the input from the public. And then we tend to provide multiple ways for the facilitator to give us that input back. They can fax it, they can scan and email it, they can drop it back off, or they can even call it in. And so what you get are fascinating groups of people participating, whether it be at their neighborhood level or at the church or in their household. This picture actually comes from a gathering that took place at the Asian American Cultural Center here in Austin, where they facilitated having a number of boxes on hand all at one time. And so folks felt more comfortable coming to the Asian American Cultural Center than they might have to some city facility far away from their homes. And we had a few dozen boxes in play all at one time. So it makes for a more convenient experience, a slightly safer experience, because you might be with people you already know or feel more comfortable with, and so you'll be a bit more honest, and it's more flexible in the scheduling and staging of it. In a similar vein, we've taken our public engagement out on the road, and so we've positioned ourselves at either events where we expect large crowds or just hot spots around the community. This picture comes from a major community festival where we set up a station to get people's input, people of all ages, I should point out, on streetscapes and transportation design. So these were magnets that people could manipulate to show us what they wanted out of their streetscape. Do they want bike lanes? Do they want dedicated lanes for transit? How many lanes do they want for cars, and so on? And so by virtue of catching people where they are, you're getting them in a convenient way, a fairly safe way. It's anonymous, and it's great for people who don't have much time but still would like to give you some meaningful input. So we just call it Speak Week, but it's something you could repurpose easily in your community. Another thing we've tried to do is make highest and best use of our television stations. So most cities and counties and school districts and others have access to a dedicated government access TV channel. And most of them just carry the official city council or school board or county commission meetings. But what we've done is we've taken a public meeting and put it on television live and also streamed it live, and then opened toll-free lines in English and Spanish, and a Twitter hashtag and a text message code. And through that combination of tools, a meeting that might have gotten 60 people would instead get 6,000 people participating. And so clearly you're able to reach a wider and more diverse audience than just the people that can self-select to participate in the meeting. We've also developed short 5 to 6 minute videos that we can use as introductory overviews for people to watch either online or on TV or in person when they come to a public meeting, so that they kind of quickly get up to speed on what it is that we're doing that night. So leveraging TV, telephone, and text, as well as social media all in one space, can really enhance the diversity of input that you're getting and give you a better glimpse of what an entire public might think. There's a lot of folks that are doing a lot with online engagement. I wanted to share with you this set of principles of online engagement that a company called Bang the Table, kind of a funny name, came up with. One of which is know yourself and know your promise. Understand what it is that you are offering to the public when they engage online. Don't rely upon online engagement tools, but make sure you have ways for people to participate that don't have a computer. Present information objectively, without spin, without bias. Think about how your community's learning styles and needs are. You may have a high population of folks who are using certain sites more than they're using sort of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So where should you be engaging? Build a relationship, get them to create a profile and be in touch with them in more than just a one-shot kind of way, and be very clear about how much time there is to engage so folks don't misunderstand how much of an opportunity they have to participate. So here are a couple of ways that we've looked at engagement online. You're looking at a screenshot from our site, which is known as speakupaustin.org, which is now part of what's known as the Civic Ideas platform, which is hosted by a company called Granicus. And so it's similar to some other platforms out there that you may have seen, like MindMixer. One of the things, though, that we've really tried hard to do with our site is to create multiple ways for people to participate on that site. So here what you see is a forum that was set up on a particular topic, an initiative in North Austin known as Restore Runberg. You'll notice how many ideas we got, how many comments we got. What people could do is they could go on and contribute their own idea for a way to improve the neighborhood, and then other people could go on and comment upon that idea or just vote for that idea. And that was an easy way for the staff to get a clearer sense of what some of the ideas were that the public felt strongest about. We've also used the forum to put up policy options that the city would propose and have the public react to those ideas, and that tends to get a lot of traction. But then we've also used discussion boards, and discussion boards are easier for more open-ended earlier phases of a conversation. So in this case, we were asking the public about a golf course proposal, and we wanted to ask sort of open-ended questions. And the difference between doing a survey and doing this is that it's really an interactive conversation, not just among citizens, but between the city and the citizenry. With a survey, you're sort of anonymously submitting your input. You aren't able to really see what other people are saying. You sort of have to rely upon the government entity to share what it is that they heard, and it's also a little harder sometimes to aggregate open-ended responses to surveys. But with an online transparent discussion, what you're getting is a clearer sense of the different threads of conversation and a way for the host of the conversation, in this case the city, to interact with the public, to clarify things, to make sure misinformation doesn't spread, to make sure the space stays safe, and to just generally broaden the scope of folks who can participate. So this is the discussion board on Speak Up Austin. So there's a lot of content that I covered there, and I certainly would love to take your questions, but I also want to make folks aware that I'm going to be hosting a 3-day course that delves into these topics in a lot more depth at the University of Texas at Austin at the Strauss Institute for Civic Life in February. There's more information on our website. We have offered the course already once and got folks from around the country, and so we would welcome folks from anywhere in the country to join us in beautiful Austin in the late winter, early spring. One of the nice things about the course is it's chopped up into 3 one-day modules, and so if there's 1 or 2 modules that appeal to you more than all 3, you can choose to go out the course that way. You can also, though, attend for all 3 days. So we touch on things like designing a public process, using technology, honing your facilitation skills, and we do a lot of role play to give you feedback on how to improve in those areas. So would welcome your participation in that, and more importantly, would welcome your participation now with questions or comments that you have as I whip through that presentation. Thanks for listening.
Well, thanks, Larry. This is Maria Vanderkolk again, and I don't think we've gotten any questions yet from our participants, but I have a couple I'd love to ask you. I work. That's one of the
perks of being the host. You get the
I work for a city, and we have tried over the years various forms of public engagement. And I think the biggest problem we typically have is just getting people to show up in the first place. Once you get them there, there's wonderful ideas that you've presented, but getting them there in the first place has been a huge challenge for us. For example, a few years ago, we tried to do public engagement meetings in each of our council districts, and we scheduled the meetings for locations that were not at City Hall but out in the community, tried to make it as easy as possible for people. And unless there was a major issue in the neighborhood that people were upset about, we would have, 20 staff people and 3 citizens, and it just was an exercise in futility for us.
Absolutely, and I won't pretend that that's never been a challenge for me, Maria. That's certainly something that I think folks like me encounter, frequently over the course of our careers. Let me give you a couple of ways that I've found are effective in generating additional participation. I mean, one I think is sort of turning the apple cart over a little bit and thinking less about trying to get people to come to one of your meetings and instead going to places where people are already meeting. And so one of the ways that we've done that is by offering ourselves to the sort of large community organizations that we know are having standing recurring meetings that get big attendance. So the Austin Neighborhoods Council, the Real Estate Council of Austin, the Chamber of Commerce, affordability advocates that meet regularly in large groups. And we say, we'll come to you and we'll solicit input from your organization and then ask that your organization help disseminate, an online tool or a survey or something that we are using to collect input. So part of it, I think, is getting a little bit away from being as focused on attendance to public meetings, because I think the reality is for a lot of people, they've sort of built their lives. They've got their jobs, they've got their families, they've got maybe, graduate school or what have you, and they've got some community commitments, and so there's not a lot of space to commit to other activities. But if you find ways to engage them within the course of that other participation that they're doing, then I think that you can be really effective at getting more people's input. I also think that partnerships with media outlets can really be effective. So we, for about 3 years, had a weekly 3 or 4 minute segment on our NPR station where each week we were coming in to talk about a different new local issue and a way for people to get involved with it, an upcoming meeting or an online board or what have you. And so that really helped to drive some attendance, because the listeners to that particular station are very engaged. They listen religiously, small r, and so that was a way to sort of get more people plugged into what we were doing. And then a third way, I think, comes from the way in which you frame the issues for discussion. So one of the things that we figured out when it came to the bond process was we could just say, we're having meetings about the bonds, please come. And we probably would have gotten some, finance graduate students and maybe some other super citizens that come to all of our meetings, but not very many other people. And so what we did as a frame was we said, essentially, we're facing a crisis. We have about $1.5 billion worth of needs in our community, but only $400 million to spend. How should we spend it? And I think that sense of urgency and that feeling that there was a really important decision to be made and that it was important for you to participate in that decision helped us with our attendance. Just like with our Imagine Austin comprehensive planning process, we said not just we're creating a vision for the future, but we're expecting to double in population within 30 years in our same area. How do we deal with that? What's the way that we should go about managing the enormous growth that we're facing, which is something that's on the minds of just about everybody in Austin. So I think that's another way to go about increasing attendance, to really frame the issues in a way that's going to make people think that there is a pressing and compelling opportunity for them to participate. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions. The first one is there a particular application that you've used for the online boards?
Yeah, I assume that's a reference to Speak Up Austin, to those online boards, and the answer is yes. We developed this website initially locally with a local company, but eventually it became part of what's called Civic Ideas, which is one word, which is currently overseen by a company called Granicus, Granicus. Folks have probably seen Mind Mixer and Idea Scale and some other companies that are doing similar work, and I don't want to sort of promote one company's work over another. I would just say that they're all doing some fantastic work in this regard. There also are several tools out there that are less discussion-driven and either survey-driven, or there's several that look at allocation. So like for budgets or for bonds or issues where you're trying to balance the budget or deal with lots of money and how to make trade-offs. There's a tool out there called Budget Allocator that's one of several that really makes that experience very easy for the typical member of the public to do. But our particular application is called Civic Ideas through a company called Granicus. Hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, great. Next question. What are best practices in managing expectations so that the public engagement session, whoops, I just slipped down on me, excuse me. I'll start over again. What are the best practices in managing expectations so that the public engagement session doesn't derail or go way off topic? How can staff stay empowered to keep the meeting on track?
These are great questions. So my best practices are basically 2 or 3-fold. One is that I print an agenda that I provide everyone, and at the top of the agenda is our objective or objectives for the evening. And what that does for me is it makes it really easy as a facilitator for me to check in with folks and say, help me understand how it is that what you're sharing is related to our objective for tonight, because I don't want to be judgmental about it and say, hey, sir or ma'am, you're just way off base here, or you're way off on a tangent. It could be that there is a relationship to it, I just don't know what it is, but it's important that I keep the public on task and on topic. That's what I'm there for as a facilitator. And so to be empowered to do that, I go over the agenda at the beginning and I hand it to folks, and sometimes I do a PowerPoint slide with it, because then I'm transparent about how I'm going to decide whether someone's on topic or not, because I'm going to try to see, is this directly relevant to our objective? And if it isn't, what other ways do we have to get them to fill out a comment card or send an email or post on an online platform, or in other ways give us that input if it's not directly related to our objective. So I think that's one key way to manage expectations is to clearly communicate what the meeting is about in the form of an objective on a printed agenda. And in terms of preventing derailment, I also really feel strongly about discussion guidelines, which is another way of saying rules. But discussion guidelines, at least the ones that I use, are really framed more around sort of group agreements about how we're going to conduct ourselves, which are things like we're going to listen with an open mind, and we're going to focus on people's ideas, not their personalities, and things of that nature. And if folks are interested, they can email me, and I'm happy to share the discussion guidelines that I've used. They're borrowed from another source. And so I think that those discussion guidelines are really important. I often ask groups if I can have their commitment to uphold those guidelines and follow them, and I get nods of the head or even signatures on a poster just to sort of affirm that we're really going to have a productive conversation. And when there are cases where those seem under threat, I sort of intervene and I say, so I want to reiterate that these are the agreements we made, and I want to make sure everybody is comfortable with complying with these. So I would say the objective and the discussion guidelines are really key.
While I'm thinking about it, Larry,
Sure.
and I don't know, there may be an email going out to our participants, but could you provide your email address while I'm
Sure.
thinking about it?
Yeah, it's I'll put it in the this may only go to you, and I'm not sure if this will be visible to everybody, but it's just Larry, Larry, .schooler, SCHOOLER, at Austin, Texas, full words spelled out, .gov. So Larry.schooler at Austin, Texas, AUSTINTEXAS.gov.
Great, thanks. Okay, next question. I would like to hear suggestions or ideas about changing the mindset of agency staff regarding public participation. In other words, encouraging staff to embrace different approaches, recognizing that the project manager or agency lead may not be the best representative on an issue or for a meeting.
That is so great a question, because I've experienced that very challenge several times over the course of my career. Because I should mention that my position here at the city is only 5.5 years old, and I'm the only person to be in it until I hired a colleague last year. So I've had to sort of do exactly what this question is talking about. One of the things that I often find is effective in encouraging staff to embrace different approaches is to use an example of a process or an approach that didn't lead to the results that they wanted. We actually have a case locally that's just popped up where a proposal didn't seem to have a ton of public input and came to council and then got basically shelved, delayed, at least for the next few months. And I think part of the reason was the perception that there really wasn't sufficient way or opportunity for the public to weigh in and affect the outcome of that project. Well, that's obviously very frustrating to staff. It really affects and impedes their ability to do their jobs. And so sometimes I'll say, well, let's talk about this process that you've used in the past. How did you feel about it? How did you feel about the outcome of it? And would you be open to trying something different that might lead to a different result? Because at the end of the day, public administrators want to be effective just like anybody else. And if you have a way for them to be more effective in getting their job to fruition, their work done, usually I think they're receptive to experimenting or trying something else. The second part of the question is also very interesting, because I think that it's often been the case that project manager or agency lead has tried to represent an issue or lead a meeting. And one of the reasons my position was created was it's very difficult for a person in that role to have an unbiased feeling or stay neutral on a topic where they have a lot of expertise and are ultimately charged with making policy recommendations. And so sometimes if I've encountered that, I'll say, well, let me ask you, what if someone said X during a meeting? Would you be able to, sort of neutrally respond, or would you feel compelled to sort of correct that impression and sort of rebut their position? And I think that, as we get into that conversation, sometimes what they realize is, that could really get out of hand. If it becomes a debate between me and some citizens, then we could really get off course. And I've seen that happen, and there are use cases that I can give departments to say, you remember that meeting when we talked about, the dog park or whatever, and, the staff member really got off on a personal viewpoint instead of staying neutral. And so it comes down to sort of talking about it in terms of helping them be successful. Their goal, I think, is to get the policy developed or the project done on time and on budget, and the more that we can do to help them do that, obviously, the better. And so showing them how an independent facilitator can help with that, and how getting the public more involved earlier and more thoroughly, how that can help alleviate issues that came up in the past. I think those are two ways to go about that.
Okay. The next question is, can you better define the discussion guideline you mentioned?
It's a great question. I don't want to have people look at my whole desktop at the moment, but what I'll do is, as I'm talking here, I'm going to pull up the list of guidelines that I use, if I can get to it quickly, and encourage folks to take a look at it. Mine are pulled from a thing called Conversation Cafe, which is a very well-established kind of methodology for conducting a dialogue, not just with citizens, but really with anybody. And the guidelines are really meant to be there for the benefit of creating a safe space for dialogue. And so, instead of saying, don't interrupt, it might say, help everyone participate, or make sure everyone has a good opportunity to do so. So as I said, I'm going to try and pull this up so that I'm not talking in such abstract terms, but can instead read off to you a list. Here's core principles. Let's see if that is what I'm looking for. But basically, it's a set of agreements that folks can really agree upon, that are real straightforward, that are designed to be very very inclusive, very open, and make sure that people feel like they are welcome, and that even if they present an unpopular opinion, that's not going to sort of lead to some backlash. I think that's sometimes what folks are most concerned about. Like, I don't want to sort of get shouted down. So here are some agreements that Conversation Cafe uses that I've used. Open-mindedness, listen to and respect all points of view. Acceptance, suspend judgment as best you can. Curiosity, seek to understand rather than to persuade. Discovery, question assumptions and look for new insights. Sincerity, speak from your heart and personal experience. And brevity, go for honesty and depth, but don't go on and on. So again, that's at conversationcafe.org under the host manual, and I've essentially plagiarized those for my benefit in meetings that I host, because I find them to be really effective.
Okay, great. The next question. For ongoing online consultations, what advice do you have to encourage registered participants to move from just lurking to actually participating in the discussion? And do you have any advice to help overcome the user's privacy concerns in online consultations?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if we can get clarification on the second part of the question, but I'm wondering if the question is concerns about they want to be more private, or concerns that people are sort of able to be more anonymous online, because I've heard it sort of both ways. I mean, a privacy concern might be, I'm going to register for this, and y'all are going to start sending me a bunch of stuff and invade my privacy that way, or people aren't using their real names, for instance, and so then they're able to sort of go off and be a little bit more brash than they might be if they had to sort of own what they were saying and identify themselves. So on number two, I guess what I would say is overcoming concerns can be done by keeping it fairly easy for someone to participate. I mean, we have a registration that is simply providing us with a name and an email address, and we don't even do authentication of that email address, so it's a pretty low barrier to entry. There are other sites that require email authentication to know that it's a real person. Some require a profile. We keep it pretty basic. Give us a name and an email address, and the idea is that then we're able to repeatedly be in touch with that person when new topics come up on our site, but we don't email them for any reason other than there's new content on Speak Up Austin, or if for some reason they were posting in inappropriate ways, but that has so seldom happened. When it comes to advice to encourage registered participants to move from just lurking to actually participating, I think that in large part it's being in more regular contact with them than just once. Basically more frequently checking in and saying, hey, we've got a new topic, would love to hear from you. Because I think a lot of times with any form of participation, people weigh in when they hear about a topic that's very specific to them, and then they sort of check out. And so what you get are sort of partisans on that issue. But I think by virtue of having about 3,500 registered users on Speak Up Austin that I'm able to email with a click of one button, I get a much broader array of views than just the folks that are really strongly passionate about that one issue. So I guess the advice I would have is to make use of that email list, to make use of social media, and to consistently promote the site as much as you can, so that it really feels like a space that you really need to be in, as opposed to simply kind of a cute, fun activity board, if that makes sense.
Now, on that last question, I think you probably addressed this, but they provided a clarification that must have been an experience that they had. The participants worried that their comments will be tracked back to them and to the organizations that they represent, that they wanted more privacy.
Yeah, and like I said, I think there's all different points of view about how online participants should be identified or registered or both, and we've sort of erred on the side of very minimal identification rather, as opposed to something more detailed, and we found that that's pretty sufficient. In other words, it helps us to kind of keep in touch with and keep track of who we're trying to be in touch with, but at the same time not make people feel like they're going to sort of be held responsible. But we've also had folks post on behalf of organizations, and we've had folks who give the disclaimer, this is just my personal point of view, I'm not speaking on behalf of any organization. So that hasn't been a concern that's ever been raised to me. It may exist out there, but I haven't really encountered it very much on this site.
Okay, great. Next question. Can you elaborate on best practices for reaching underrepresented populations?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that some of the tools that I talked about in the presentation are ones that I would consider to be effective for reaching underrepresented populations. For instance, when it comes to the TV town hall, what we did there was we didn't just create toll-free numbers. We actually auto-dialed several thousand Austin households and ended up reaching quite a few older senior citizens and a lot of folks who just didn't know we were doing any engagement, but were thrilled to be on the phone and able to weigh in, to do polling via their touchtone phone and to actually speak. I mean, we would press 0 to speak to a screener, and then I would see on my little screen there who wanted to get in and do like a sort of a radio talk show to add their voices into the telecast. And for folks who are interested, if you go to atxn.tv, which is our city television station, if you look for interactive town hall meeting, you'll see the 3 or 4 episodes of this that we've done to kind of show you how this all integrates together. So making use of those resources can really help you to capture input from folks who just would never self-select to come to a meeting but might still find it interesting. The Mayor's Youth Council, and I know that youth councils are fairly common in many cities, but the establishment of an effective youth council for high school students is an interesting and compelling way to get youth involved, particularly if they're running for election to that council and representing kind of a segment of the city. When it comes to low-income populations and to folks for whom English might not be their first language, I think part of it has to do with providing effective resources at meetings, whether it be childcare, refreshments, interpreters, ADA compliant spaces, transit-friendly spaces, meaning places you can easily reach without having to drive or them being far away from a bus stop or a train station. But the other thing that I think is effective is really going where folks are already going, which is to say, really thinking in terms of Speak Week about, where are these populations going to be? Are they at the grocery store? Are they at the farmer's market? Are they at cultural festivals? Are they at church? Where can we expect to sort of catch large numbers of folks and get their input that way? So those are some best practices that I've seen and that I've seen us use that I think help with underrepresented populations.
Okay, well that is finishes up all of our questions, and just want to thank everybody for participating. Again, if you are a member of NAGC, this presentation will be available to members on our website. Larry, I'd like to thank you so much for for this. I did not read some of the comments that, in addition to the questions that things like wonderful presentation, etc., but it was very helpful and very informative, and we thank you very much for participating.
And my pleasure. Thanks to everybody for great questions, and certainly if you have others, feel free to email, and we'd love to see you all in Austin in February to learn more, but keep the conversation going, and thanks for such thoughtful questions and great participation.
Great. Thank you, everybody.